Welcome to the Safety and Risk Success podcast with me, Christian Harris. Today's episode is a powerful conversation with John Barclay, founder of Barclays and a man on a mission to create a fatality-free future. After being a first responder to a workplace fatality early in his career, John has spent decades trying to answer a difficult question. How do serious incidents still happen in organizations that genuinely care about safety? So in this episode, we explore why activity doesn't always equal effectiveness, how to focus on exposure rather than injury numbers, and why the absence of harm doesn't mean the presence of safety. We also discuss the importance of involving the workforce, building trust, and making the safest way the easiest way to work. If you're interested in reducing serious risk, cutting safety waste, and focusing effort where it really makes a difference, then this conversation is packed with insight. Hope you enjoy the episode, and if you do, please hit subscribe, give us a like, share, and a comment on social media. Enjoy my conversation with John Barclay.
Welcome to the Safety and Risk Success podcast with Christian Harris. We believe that proactive safety and risk management powers business performance. Each week we explore this theme, sharing guests, stories, insights, trends, hints and tips. You can find us on all the major podcasting platforms, and video versions are available on YouTube. But for now, let's join the conversation with Christian.
Thanks for joining me today, John.
Great to be on board. Looking forward to our conversation.
Good man. I hope it's not too late at night for you.
No, it's actually a good time. It's about 6 p.m, so it's nice and early in the evening. So just had a bite to eat and now settling in for the night. So it's good.
Oh, perfect. So do a podcast, have a beer, relax. Perfect.
Exactly. Yeah.
Good man. It was just the start of my day, so I've got a long day ahead, but I'm looking forward to this conversation. I thought we'd start, John, by a bit of your kind of backstory. So you mentioned before that you were the first responder at a workplace fatality, and sort of without going into too much detail on that, obviously, how did that kind of shape your view about how you think about safety?
Yeah, so I was only really early in my career as an emergency response team member. So I was not real. I thought I was prepared for an emergency, but I really wasn't. And I think all the training you do doesn't prepare you well enough for those moments where you really do see tragedy in front of you. And it really shook me at the moment. I look back and I realized I was probably in a fair bit of shock after that, and it took me a while to process a lot of that afterwards. So for me, it was the weeks after that I just kept reflecting on. I mean, this was a tradesman who'd been working in that trade for 20 odd years, so a very experienced person, right, who'd been working around suspended loads a long time. And I just kept asking myself, so how does that happen when someone with so much experience? I've been in this organization for a couple of years. So my perception at the time was it was an organization that was focused on safety. It was a lot of effort being put into the safety side of things, and systems and processes were well established. Again, I was fairly young and new coming through, so I didn't really know whether that was a good version or not, but it seemed very effective and serious to me. And so how do we have someone so experienced in an organization that seems to be focused on and valuing the safety of people end up in that situation? And that stuck with me for a while, and I was asking that question. So that took my career path out of operations straight into safety, and I've sort of been on that journey ever since, trying to understand risk and try to understand human decision making. And I then stepped out of the safety role and got into consulting, mainly because I saw that as an opportunity to maybe get across multiple organisations rather than just be within one organisation. I felt if I really wanted to learn and really wanted to go understand things, I needed to branch out into different places, and I was lucky enough to join an organisation at the time called Russell Consulting, who was an affiliate of Behavioural Science Technology, who was owned and run by Dr. Krause. So that gave me a chance to really learn a lot about, in their world, exposure, but basically risk and culture and leadership and people, and really try to seek to understand why things happen. And everything that leads to a significant incident comes from a multiple lead up of decisions at different
Yeah.
levels, at different situations. And I've just been really curious about that ever since. And I still say today I'm a student in that space. I think the science is evolving all the time. I don't think I keep up well enough sometimes. I think, when you read and look at all the different perspectives out there, I stay really open to it. And I just think it's led me to the place where I started my business in 2018, Barclays, or Barclay Safety Solutions, and it's here in Australia. And I started that in line with my life purpose, which was to try and prevent fatalities and
Yeah.
protect the well-being of people at work. And again, as an organisation, we're still trying to find the best ways to help organisations get better at creating an environment where hopefully we can have a future where it's fatality free. And that's the sort of conversation we like to have with people is, what can we be doing that will help create a fatality free future?
Yeah. Perfect. So, I was going to ask you about that kind of being very, very mission led. So I'm glad you've brought that up. So when a leader says to you something like, we care about safety, you mentioned that organization you were in, your perception was, they cared about safety, they were doing things, et cetera, et cetera. Um, what do you think that they maybe misunderstand about what caring about safety really requires? So we can all say we care about safety, but what's the
Yeah.
missing link, I suppose?
Look, I think there's always a few different bits, and you're right. Almost 90 odd percent of the people I meet have a genuine care for for their people, and they don't
Yeah.
want people to get seriously hurt or die at work, right? I mean, there is a genuine interest and genuine authentic position to not have that happen at work. I think there's a few things. So I sort of ground myself in a couple of things. One is I don't think we always truly understand the hazardous source in the first place. I think we surface level talk and look at hazards and don't truly understand how the energy release presents the biggest risk for people in different contexts. So, uh, a suspended load context, for example, that I was involved in, has a
Mm.
few different scenarios where that can present different challenges for people. And I just think we overgeneralize the fundamental first stage of good risk management, which is hazard identification. And
Yeah.
there's a recent research that I looked at was, just looking at how hazards aren't equal, right? So there's some obvious hazards. People see things, they're pretty obvious to them. They try and manage them. That then gets watered down by some trivial hazards. There's things that
Hmm.
we try and draw people's attention to that are a little bit more trivial to people. And sometimes we focus too heavily on those because they're easy to do, and therefore then people overlook them. The bit I think that catches people out, there are hazards that emerge throughout the work that we didn't preempt in the first place. So I think that's still a bit of a challenge for us. Is I have a genuine care for my team, and I say to them all the time, make sure you look for your hazards and identify your hazards and those sorts of things. But I just don't think we truly understand the complexity of good hazard identification and getting that right. I
Mm.
think we're all familiar with the challenge of assessing risk. Yeah, because everyone has a different perspective of risk. People's biases come in, and some have a very low risk perception of things, others have a high risk perception of things. So, I know
Yeah.
even myself, um, I have a bit of a low risk perception while driving. I think I'm a pretty good driver. So, I tend to probably have overconfidence in some of the hazards that are associated with driving. I think I've gotten better as I got older, but I was a
Mhm.
very low risk perception person in driving. But after that fatality experience for me, I had a very heightened risk perception of suspended loads. But yet, if you talk to riggers and the crane operators who work with them all the time, they tend to get a little bit lower risk perception of things.
Yeah.
And then I think the next thing is people get stuck on just making sure the controls are present, not
Mhm.
really working. So a lot of leaders, and this is probably now reflecting back on the organization I was working with at the time, will do a lot to go out and do their checks. Like they just go out and check, make sure things are happening the way they should be happening. but I don't think we dig deep enough to really understand, are those controls the appropriate controls, and are they actually doing the things that we think they're doing?
Yeah, yeah. That definitely resonates with me. I mean, I've told this story loads of times, but I have done polls on LinkedIn and other places for safety professionals many times in the past and said, um, when you start a new role in safety, how often do you find things you can improve? Is it always, often, rarely, or never? And it's almost always sort of 80% would say always, then the rest would be pretty much often. Nobody ever
Mm,
says never, right? So the
correct.
challenge there, if you shine a mirror on that, is, well, if when we're starting a new role we can always find things to improve, does that not mean that there's probably going to be lots of things we can improve in the way we're doing it already? And you're right that sort of superficially looking, are these controls there? Well, that's good in the sense of, we're not neglecting anything, but
Mm,
actually, should we not be challenging ourselves to, is that the best we can do? How could we do
mm.
this differently? Um, if something bad did happen and we were being investigated, and a microscope was being shined on us, would this stand up?
Yeah.
I don't think those sorts of reflections happen often enough.
No, and I think we make an assumption because we're doing a lot of activity. Yeah, because I know one of the key measures now as organizations are trying to move away from injury data, they're trying to now measure just the level of activity. How many inspections are we doing? How many audits are we doing? How many verifications are we doing? And I think that sort of gives us a false sense of how well things are working. Just because we're doing a lot of stuff, it doesn't always mean that it's adding the value we think it's having. And I still think this is the challenge we've got right now is how do we actually look at what everything we're doing, how do we look at it from an effectiveness point of view rather than just
Yeah.
a level of activity point of view?
Hmm. Yeah, definitely agree with you there.
Mm,
And I mean, if thinking about, serious injuries and fatalities,
mm.
there's a difference obviously between looking at managing incident data and managing exposure to that kind of serious risk. What would be some of the maybe two or three things that you would advise an organization to do if they wanted to sort of take this a bit more seriously, be a bit more introspective and try and effect some change and improvement?
Well, look, I think the fundamental thing I think that sits under, besides the technical stuff of identifying and working through your processes, the stuff we're talking about as serious injuries and fatalities is generally low frequency events. Like they don't happen very often. When you look globally and you look across the industries, yes, they happen a lot more than we want, and they happen a
Of
lot
course,
more
yeah.
than.
Yeah.
But when you look at
With eight,
individual
with sort of 7 billion people, there that you're bound to have, a certain number
organizations,
of things happening if you look at it on that bigger scale, yeah.
correct. But if you sort of bring it down to the localized operating area, they may go decades without a serious injury or a fatality, right? So
Yeah.
I just think for me, it's that chronic unease. It's how do we collectively help each other not become overly confident that everything's working. So what stuck out to me years ago was a mentor of mine said, look, the absence of injury or the absence of harm doesn't mean the presence of safety. And what I've started to apply that point to is, look, the absence of serious injuries and fatalities doesn't mean the presence of good fatality prevention.
Yeah.
So I just want people to stop creating more and more bias because we haven't had it happen. Because something bad hasn't happened, it doesn't mean we're exposed to it happening.
Yeah.
And I want people to focus on where is our exposure, what is it like, and just because it's good today, just because we're managing it really well today, doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be really well managed tomorrow. And I think that's the underlying challenge out there for all of us is we go out and do a check with work that's got two or three, critical risks or fatality potential exposures in there, and it's all going really well today. Everything seems to be working the way we want it to. The exposure seems really low, seems to be really well managed, um, and we get that confirmation bias, we get that recency bias kicking in where just the last couple of checks I've done, it's been really good. So maybe I can back off. Maybe I can go focus
Yeah.
on something else. Maybe I don't need to pay attention to that anymore. And I just think that chronic unease is what helps people just go check it in a bit more
Mm.
depth, just tick in the box that yes, it's there, yes, it's there. And I talk to organizations about four things. One is yes, it needs to be present. That's the basic, right? Whatever your control is, it needs to be present. I'm then curious, do people understand what that controls? Like, do they actually understand how it's meant to work and how it's helping keep them safe? Do they actually know how it's working? And that might seem obvious, and more often than not, they do, but there's generally, I've had quite a few field experiences where people were just putting controls in place because that's what the procedure said. They didn't really understand how it was meant to help them. It didn't really make sense to them why they were doing those things.
Yeah.
Um, you know, the third one for me is it actually being effective? Is it set up in a way to effectively manage prevention of energy release? So there are certain types of controls that when they're in place, and that's why they end up getting defined as critical controls, really do contain failure. They do really
Yeah.
contain that situation where if it does go wrong, we've got the capacity to fail safe. And then the last one is, are people following them? So
Hmm.
yeah, is it present? Do they understand? Um, is it actually effective at containing and doing the control? And are people following it, or are there moments? Are there times when we bypass them? Is there times where
Yeah.
it doesn't really go the way it should be going because people have had to get innovative and find ways around them?
Yeah. I really like that. I've written those four things down. I think that's really, really good. Um, and I think that that's four very simple things to think
Hmm.
about. They're not simple to answer those questions, obviously, but a simple framework to approach. How effective, how well are the controls doing for you? And yeah, taking what we've just been talking about for the last few minutes. Just think about those four things, jot them down, go
Mm.
around your workplace, and ask yourself those four questions. And I suspect that you'd be pretty surprised with some of the answers that might come up. Is that your experience when people start doing that?
It is, and I think the other part here is the trust or people have to be open and honest and transparent. So I
Yeah.
think if people are able to build the trust where we can talk about things honestly and openly, those four elements can become extremely powerful when people can explain to you those situations where where they've got to bypass the control. And I know that sounds, people are probably hearing that and going, no, there's no scenario where you can bypass a control. And again, there's been plenty of studies done where they can look at, we set an expectation of someone to do something, and there are certain times it's really easy for people to do that and follow that. It can be really easy for them to do. There can be times where it can be difficult for them to do it, and it may take a lot of extra time, effort, focus, those sorts of things to be able to do it. And there's a very small percentage of times where people have a choice to make, that they either can't follow the control or implement the control and just get the job done, or
Mhm.
stop and not do it at all. And that's why obviously the Stop Work Authority has a very big theme globally as well, because we do want people to feel safe to stop. But that there's got to be high trust in an organization for people to feel safe to just stop and say, I
Yeah.
don't think we should progress. And the examples I use, a simple one I think we can all relate to, is just wearing seatbelts in vehicles, right? I'd say probably 70, 80% of the time, it's pretty easy for us to do that, right? They're generally easy to put on. Most cars now keep telling you to put it on. So it's generally easy for us to do. But if you sort of think about some of the machines people use, if the seatbelt's gotten dirt in it and it's now stuck, it can be a little bit more difficult for people to wear those things. And sometimes we put them in certain pieces of equipment that doesn't have a seatbelt in it, so therefore then they can't. And there might be certain parts of their job where they've got to take it off so they can see.
Yeah.
So it's that curiosity for me about what makes it really difficult for people to follow the controls that we're actually hoping people are actually implementing.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's really, really important to bear in mind. And it brings me on actually nicely to the next sort of topic that I wanted to talk to you about, which is kind of how do we involve the workplace? So doing safety with people, not to them, and obviously that trust and understanding is kind of a key component of that. So it's a theme that you speak about a lot. Why is it so important that we do safety with people?
Oh, fundamentally, they're the ones doing the work. They're the ones experiencing what it's like to do work in the construct of how we're trying to set up work to happen. So they're working in the situation, they're working in the environment that we're creating for them to do. So it is absolutely vital to understand what they're experiencing. I think this is still one of the biggest challenges is quite a few sit away from the work and sit away from it. They describe it, they define it as work. And I know there's lots of literature and lots of different language out there. This work imagined, we work really hard at imagining how work's going to go. And that's not always done with the workforce well enough. I just think some
Mm.
people who think they know better define the way they want work to be done. They create the policy, the procedure, the work method that they want them to follow, and then go, and I know this can sound harsh, but it's not always the case. But then they go and impose it on the workforce to follow, and wonder why they struggle to get them to buy into it, and wonder why they get them to struggle to follow it in certain scenarios. So I think having them as a part of that, how can we imagine work to happen? Help inform us with the reality of how we can imagine work to happen. But then
Mm.
we need trust so we can go back and check it, right? We can go back. So if we're going to go verify all of that, we need to involve the workforce to get feedback. So this is how we imagined it to go. So how's it actually going? Right. So what did we miss? What didn't we expect? When you came out here, what was different that you didn't expect that that wasn't sort of part of the initial planning? And that I said earlier about emerging hazards. As you got into the job, we can't sort of predict everything. Was there something that emerged that you may have managed really well, but can we learn from that next time and put it in the imagined part again so we can actually plan for that a little bit better next time?
Mm.
So yeah, I just think it's vital. I just think they're the ones doing the work. They're the ones that are exposed the most. So I think spending time with them in all parts of the system, I just think I, I just think it sets us up for success. One of the
Yeah.
things I talk about with organisations around our, getting ready for an approach to drive a fatality-free future focus is most of our systems are set up for leaders to do so, and that's generally about 20% of our workforce, right? So why wouldn't we tap into the other 80%? Like why wouldn't we collectively engage as much of that other 80% as we possibly can to really make
Yeah.
sure we get best input?
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's very, very logical, isn't it? What are some of the strategies that you've seen um, to be effective in kind of bridging that gap? Because I imagine a lot of organizations are still in that kind of work as imagined, we'll figure
Yeah.
this out and then they'll just have to follow what we say. So sort of what are the sort of bridges, I suppose, between that sort of traditional approach and what you believe is the best way?
Look, I think most organisations have mechanisms to formally consult with the workforce. So it's safety committees, health and safety reps, and that sort of language is all different around the world. I know. Generally they give them the process of doing a risk assessment prior to the work. So very, very compliancy type mechanisms for engaging. I like some of the language that's happening at the moment in different places around learning teams and those sorts of things. So bringing people in and just looking at work and doing that from a constructive point of view, not just an investigation point of view. So from our methodology and what we try and focus on is the first step is to identify stuff that can kill people and really be clear about where it exists. And we should involve people in that process as well. That tends to be done in the absence of the workforce. So we bring operational leaders in and we generally bring engineers in. We may even bring, very technical safety people into that role. But I find when that work's done in organisations about really understanding where these fatality potential hazards and risks exist, I don't think we involve the workforce enough in that stage. When we're then trying to describe the controls and how we're going to implement controls for those things, generally they're done with that same core group,
Mhm.
the operational leaders, the engineers, and again, we don't necessarily involve the workforce enough in that early stage to really understand what's going to be more beneficial in making that work, and I don't think we do enough of that. And then again, when we go out and verify all this in the workplace, is probably where I see a little bit of inconsistency. See some people really involve the workforce really well to understand how work's actually being done, and I see others still very much just ticking that things are present. So to me, those are the three main stages. I just think we need to involve them in all parts of that.
Yeah, yeah. No, another good framework there. I'm a big fan of frameworks. I think it makes things simple to understand and implementable. So yeah, good on you for that. Another thing, John, that you've spoken about quite a lot is the difference, and it kind of relates to this, is the difference between sort of making sure that people can work safely and making sure that they will work safely. Could you sort of unpack that a bit? Because I think that follows on nicely from that point.
Yeah, it sort of relates to that first point. One of those points I was talking about around understanding how work gets done and where people can either do it easy, difficult, or impossible, or not enabled. And I just think I find our role as leaders, as organisations, is to enable work to go well. So that's just trying to understand what are the resources people need for work to go well. And safety is just one aspect of that. There's obviously efficiencies, cost, quality, environment. There's a whole heap of things that sit in the spectrum of doing work well.
Hmm.
And I just think that's the main, what's the resources? And really start thinking about, at the core, humans, and I don't like to generalize, but fundamentally humans do the easiest thing. They want to do
Mhm.
the
Yeah,
things that's most easy, right? So I say make the safest thing the easiest thing.
yeah,
So I know this isn't a fatality potential one, but I sort of use this as an example because most people get it. If you want people to keep their work area clean and tidy so there's not things to trip over and there's not things to create other problems, then just make sure the bin's right at the workplace. Don't have it on the other side of the yard. Don't have it at the other end of the workshop. Just it should be on the job, and that enables people to be able to do things. We then think about the other part of can work safely is I think we overestimate the value of putting people in a classroom and doing training and expect them
yeah,
to walk out competent.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, it was just something I learned years ago, running training. I was like, I'm doing all this training. I'm trying to get really practical learning in this day, in this classroom. But still, when you went back out and saw what was happening, you had this massive variation of how people would still do work. So if we want people so they can work safely, we've got to genuinely do hands-on coaching and development on the job. And I know organizations go into verification of competency to try and robust that training process. But unfortunately, I see a lot of that get into it's just I need to sign you off to go do the job. And I don't think we really
Yeah.
help the competency part of it as much as we could.
Mm.
So I think it's there. And then the will work safely. So we'll want to work safely. It comes back to one, trust. If it's a high trusting environment, I'm absolutely blown away when I see a high trusting environment, how loyal and motivated people come to doing what's expected and really working hard to doing work the best way we possibly can. I think when we see very low trusting environments, people stay skeptical. They don't agree a lot. They want to argue, but they don't argue to solve. They tend to argue to move against, and we tend to get that laggard group grow
Mm.
because of it. So I just think that trusting environment is what drives the people to want to work safely and will work as safely as possible and will stop the job if they're unsure. I was just speaking to someone today over here who does a lot of speaking around his story, Theo Veda, and he yeah, he talks about um, connecting people to their purpose and getting them really connected to why they're there, and just making sure they understand that a lot of that last minute decision making comes from a gut feel. And if your gut's not right, like if something in your gut's telling you this isn't quite right, it
Yeah.
probably isn't. And that's a probably good signal to stop and have
Yeah.
that motivation to just stop and reassess and move things through.
Mm.
But I just want to be really clear for all the listeners. Everything I'm talking about here is it's not easy. It takes
No.
consistent focus, it takes consistent engagement, it takes really good, honest conversations, it takes really important self-reflection. I know when I started my business and started building a team, and that trusting environment has been very important to me. And but I'm human. Sometimes I do things that might make people feel like, oh, can I really go to John with that issue? Can I
Mm.
really raise my opinion here? Can I really challenge that decision? And I had one of my colleagues quite a few years ago say, John, is the reason why people are starting to drop off in their engagement sometimes is not because of something you've said. They pick up your behavioral cues. They pick up where your eyes go. They pick up the facial expression that comes. They pick up the tenseness that comes in your shoulders. So like I say, I'm always a student in this space, and I encourage
Mm.
everyone to just be really open to getting some honest feedback around. So, what do you do when you're hearing something that you don't like hearing? Like there's someone's telling you something that makes you feel tense and feel how do you stay open to really hearing that? Because
Mm.
that's where the nuggets are. That's where we can change things when we actually hear that stuff and it's honest.
Yeah. And that point around the non-verbal communication is really um, important when we go back to some of the things you were saying about training, for example. So you can be in a classroom training people, and not to say that you, as the trainer, your non-verbal stuff wouldn't have been great, or anybody joining us today wouldn't be good at doing training. But the point is that not everybody is going to take in that information verbally because we take in 80%, I think it is, non-verbally, don't we? So it's thinking about things like visual stuff rather than just the spoken word or the written word. You know, some people can't read very well, some people don't have the vocabulary. And if you're in that kind of setting and you say a phrase and someone doesn't understand it and they're in a room with their peers, they're probably going to feel a bit embarrassed if they say, "Well, I don't really understand that." You know, we've got to bear all this stuff in mind, and that's exactly what you said. It's there's none of this stuff's easy because there's a wealth of things we've got to keep on top of. But hopefully, what we're talking about today is giving people just some thoughts on areas that they can work in.
Yeah. Yeah, because I think, we're all different. We're individuals. We all have a different
Yeah,
background. We have a different belief system. We're all different. But fundamentally, for us to feel safe to be honest with someone, we've got to be able to trust them to do the right
yeah,
thing when we're honest. And I think that's still the missing link for some people who they genuinely care. And and I do talk to some leaders where I see their care is so strong that it becomes a weakness. They tend to
mm,
overreact to things because they're so frustrated because something so bad could have happened. And I try and help them think about how do you take that care into a place where you listen deeper and you allow people to speak longer and really learn and be appreciative that nothing bad's happened yet, but you're getting some information about how to make an improvement before something bad's happened. Yeah,
mm,
and I think it's trying to help people manage their emotional connection when they're hearing something that especially when it's around a fatality potential
yeah, yeah,
situation, it can
mm,
really scare people when they hear something not working the way it should.
yeah. No, absolutely, absolutely. Last thing I was keen to talk to you about, John, was the Safe Business Index. So explain quickly what that is, and then what was the sort of problem that you were trying to solve when you developed it?
Yeah. So the Safe Business Index is really a total safety strategy diagnostic. So it's not an auditing tool. It's not a culture diagnostic. It's really looking at the whole entire safety strategy of an organization. And why did we do that? Because everything we do around trying to manage workplace risk at the job are inter are actually interconnected. They all impact each other. They all have some influence on each part of the process and each part of the system. But unfortunately, what we found was most organisations are treating everything as an individual discipline, and treating it as like. This is going to sound interesting. I know this is not always the case, but generally, we're finding, especially in the larger organisations, amount of money being spent on safety is actually not the problem.
Yeah.
Most organisations are throwing a lot of resources at safety, either money, people, or time, all those sorts of things. They're throwing a lot of investment in this space, and I just think they're not always getting the return on investment from a risk reduction and an exposure reduction and exposure management point of view that I think that they think they're getting. So we wanted to create a process that not only gave an organisation feedback around how effective their safety strategy was, but how much waste was sitting in their strategy. And it wasn't so they could then go cut all their costs. It was just so they could redistribute or at least get better outcomes with what they're investing. And sometimes you can change your process to be more efficient and more effective, so you can actually get better at it and actually save some time and money on it.
Yeah, yeah. It's a bit like the AI conversation, isn't it? Or tech conversation of, what processes are we doing that we could automate or bring in AI for and stuff. And I think most people, uh, you know, I think you said earlier, 90% plus of people really care about their team. And I think 90% plus of business leaders would not be thinking, we'll do that to then cut
Mm.
people and so on. It's then, as you say, redistributing and getting people doing more value added tasks and so on and so forth. So, yeah, I
Yeah.
think there's a huge amount of areas to improve. And one of the things that you mentioned to me before was that actually it's not, lots of organizations are almost spending too much or they're sort of wasting, yeah, too much safety. I mean, how
Yeah.
often do you see that? And then what would be the sort of experiences of, okay, we're sort of wasting, shall we say, 10%. If we can redistribute that 10%, what kind of outcomes people expect to see?
I, Look, I think it depends on where the waste is, but if the
Yeah.
waste, so the waste can sometimes, I'll use the one example where we worked with an organisation with their onboarding process, and their onboarding process had a significant part around medicals and getting checks before the person could start work. And the medical itself was ranging anywhere between sort of 600 Australian dollars to about 1,000 Australian dollars, right? And for the type of work they were doing, so going to different shutdowns and different sites, they were doing thousands of these a month, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes it could take a week to book someone in to a medical. So they were losing people because those people may have already been approved in another organisation and didn't have to go to a medical, and therefore then they could quickly drop that application and go to another one. So this organisation was spending millions of dollars on that mobilisation process. And if they just became a little bit more aware of some technology out there, there's some different approaches to just screening medicals up front that is digital now, using AI to assess people's physical, doing very clear disclosures of medical. Now, it's not perfect, but that screens out a lot of your main problems. And the research in some of these organisations doing that online screening is only about 10 or 20% of people ever really need to go do a full medical just to rule out or rule them out or rule them in. So that alone meant losing less people, keeping really good people because we didn't lose them in that process. And the online process was only like about $110 Australian. So the effectiveness was still, you weren't diluting the effectiveness. And actually, once people understood that process, they were probably really increasing their effectiveness because
Yeah.
you could hone in on those problem areas. So you can now redistribute that cost over somewhere else that you've been struggling to invest capital in to put really effective engineering controls into some of your critical risk profiles. And that's why I'm saying when we do these reviews, it's not about, oh, you can now get 1.5 million off your bottom line. It's actually about, hey, you've got these three capital projects that would actually really reduce your fatality risk or even a catastrophic failure if you went and spent for you to actually get that process happening really, really well.
Yeah. My camera's gone off. I'm not sure why. But we'll just
Okay.
carry on anyway. Uh, oh, there we go. I've come back. Um, so the answer to this, the immediate answer to this question is going to be it depends. So there's not this isn't a binary answer, but it's more about how would you approach this. So if the CEO came to you and said, right, we want to invest uh, $1 million or $100,000 or whatever it is, where in safety, where would we get the most bang for our buck? Obviously, the answer is it depends, but how would you sort of guide that conversation?
I'd want to understand the organization risk profile, like physically, and if I was just say if you've got $1 million or so you want to go and invest, can you invest that in a way to really engineer some really effective controls in your workplace, whether that's the equipment, whether that's the type of tooling that's being used in the workplace. I'd try and guide them away from just thinking more training, more another safety professional is just going to help. So I'm not saying we shouldn't, because again, it's going to be
Hmm.
dependent on
Yeah,
what they're doing already. But my experience is these serious injuries and fatalities, the exposure level stays what I class as too high because organizations are struggling to invest in good technology to drive the exposure down in the first place.
yeah,
And I just think wherever organizations can save money in the safety clutter, the safety bureaucracy that can get built, if we can save some time and some money, then hopefully we can invest that back into better design of work. Now, the last part of that I want to say is if we can find time in leaders' days, I'd rather see them spending time in the field working with their teams to making sure controls are as effective as they should be and helping their teams make those following those controls as easy as possible. But sometimes we get them stuck behind desks filling out paperwork and wonder why the stuff out in the workplace isn't going to plan.
yeah, yeah. No, that's I'm sure that's a familiar point for many people. All right, John, three quick fire questions, and then we'll wrap things up. So, um, first one, what's the most overrated safety metric?
Recordable injury frequency rate.
Yeah, I thought you were going to say that. I don't think you need to say, I don't think you need to explain that one, do you?
No, no, I just it's the most unhelpful metric we've got. It's the most manipulated metric we've got. I very, very unhelpful. I know we've got to have it, but don't
Yeah,
let it drive your decision making. Don't let it
yeah,
drive your decision making.
yeah. Exactly. Yeah. If you're in sport, obviously, the scoreboard at the end does tell you something, but it doesn't really tell you about how you've played necessarily. There's a lot of factors that
No, I
go
mean
into
I'm a
that.
football and global football here in Australia. It's soccer, and you might lose 1-0, but you had
Yeah,
80% possession and all those sorts of. So yes, or the other way around, you win 1-0
yeah,
and you only have
yeah,
30% possession and only one shot on goal and it just went in.
yeah,
So
yeah,
yeah, yeah, they can be misleading.
yeah, definitely. Most underrated leadership habit.
Curiosity. I think just being curious and staying curious longer, I think is a habit I'd like to see more leaders practice.
Taking us back to that point about chronic unease, which I really liked as an expression. And One question that every leader should be asking their frontline teams this week.
Ooh, there's a lot of great ones out there, but if leaders were going to go out and just start asking a question, it would be, so what makes following the process difficult?
Yeah, like it, like it. Good stuff. John, thank you so much. Really, really enjoyed that. Loads and loads to take away for people.
Nice.
Have you got anything you'd like to plug? Where can people best contact you to learn more? Is it LinkedIn or the website or whatever it is? Kind of over to you. The floor is yours.
Yeah, look, I mean, I'm really happy for people to reach out to me personally. So if you search me on LinkedIn, I'm pretty prominent on there. I try and do as much um, content on there as I can. I'm not a big pusher of sales on LinkedIn, so I try to put a lot of content out there that help people. So please feel free to reach out to me if you want to talk about anything from here today. You can reach me on my email, which is john@barclays with a double S, which is the safetysolutionsbit.com. And or go to our website, which is www.barclays with a double S.com. And you can also follow our podcast, hence why I really enjoy the opportunity to talk to other people on theirs. We've got our podcast called the Fatality Free Future podcast. So if you want to listen to other people who I have conversations with about some of this stuff, feel free to go have a look at that as well.
Fantastic. We'll link all of those things as well in the show notes, so they're easy for people to find. So yeah, thanks, John. Really, really enjoyed it. Appreciate it. Look forward to keeping in touch. And thanks to you for joining John and I today as well. And we'll see you next week for another episode of the Safety and Risk Success podcast.
Thanks for having me on. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for joining us on the Safety and Risk Success podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please hit follow and do share on social media. Does anyone you know spring to mind as a great guest, even yourself? If so, please contact us on podcast@slipsafety.co.uk. See you next week for another episode.